to get people to use a common language. So for monetary policy, what matters is if I see meeting by meeting or forecast by forecast above target inflation pressures rising, the playbook is, well, you better, move the interest rate up. If you see below target risk rising, you better move the interest rate down. So it's a delta. The delta is what matters. Should I change my interest rate or not? Comparing that to the asymptotic equilibrium, retrospectively, it's interesting. 30 years from now, I can say, oh yeah, that's what R-star was in the 2020s. But for now, it's not super useful. But let me just say, if you go to this just in passing, even in late 21, the market price in the yield curve had high conviction that even 5-10 years out, the policy rate in Europe was going to be around zero, nominal. So was that a comment about R-star, or was it a comment about we think you're going to struggle to deliver 2% inflation, so you're going to have basically open-endedly accommodative policies for a long time? Whereas now what's interesting is there's a high conviction we will deliver the target, that the configuration of shocks is not obviously biased to the downside, to put it politely. And so, if you like, now what we have is market discussions of cyclical interest rate policy. But if you ask them, okay, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, where are you going to be? We think you're going to be around some version of that range of neutral. I think that creates, it's a lot easier to handle monetary policy with a cyclical perspective than if that long-term anchor is lacking.
Thank you. Sure.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I will actually, I mean, obviously agree with take a similar view on the R-star discussion. One thing I would add is, it's obviously a really important concept, and I think really helps you think about the relationships in the economy. And of course, you need it for a lot of modeling, right? So you have to have an estimate of R-star in many of the different models that you use. But in terms of policy making and thinking about actually the sort of short-term policy and the sort of meeting by meeting decision, what you're actually thinking about really, and what matters most, is how restrictive or loose is policy, and how do you judge that? And there, obviously, the concept of R-star is useful, but as Philip says, you have no idea in the moment what it is now, and maybe you do over time. But that's why one of the things that in practice is really important, and that I think we all do, is you look at a whole range of indicators and data to try and get a sense of actually monetary policy and what is its impact on the economy. At this point in the cycle, how restrictive is it? And that means looking across whole ranges of monetary and financial conditions data, labor market data, what you're hearing from firms. It's a whole range of indicators. And I think that's another issue we haven't talked about around uncertainty and the world in which we're in, and how do you make policy, is actually the range of data that you have to be looking to try and calibrate your judgments, to test and cross-check them. This is a really fast expanding area, actually, in terms of the availability of data, in terms of the way in which we can process it and think about it. But in terms of the sort of R-star question as a sort of practical policy question for decision making, look at it more that way, as a sort of theoretical concept, obviously hugely important. Just on your question about sort of uncertainty and timing and those sorts of things. I mean, we in the UK did make an explicit change in 2013 to be explicit that actually the time taken to bring inflation back to target should be dependent on the circumstances and the particular shock that you are facing. And there will be some circumstances when it makes sense to take longer, and some circumstances when it makes sense to bring inflation back more quickly. And actually, you want flexibility in your approach to that. Where we were very clear is you have to explain it. So if it may be the case that you take a bit more time, but you have to be very, very clear and transparent about the judgments that you're making and why that would be the case.
Right. So just very quickly on R-star, I agree with the previous comments. I think it's a very useful variable in terms of modeling. we need to think about it because of the fact that we publish forecasts for the policy rate, right? And that the interest rate trajectory needs to be absorbed by our perceived interval for the neutral rate in the long term. We do emphasize that the estimates that we publish of the neutral rate are truly the long-term estimates, and that, in the short run, the policy rate can deviate substantially from that estimate, as it should. But I do think it's very useful. But I agree with Claire. I mean, for practical purposes, what's to say that, we are at neutral, contractionary, expansionary? It becomes increasingly hard the closer you get to something that's akin to a neutral level of the rate, right? In terms of bringing inflation back to target, I would just like to add that as long as inflation expectations are anchored at the target level, we can afford a bit more flexibility. And I think that's why it's so important to have these robust frameworks in place. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So let's now open. We have around 15 minutes for discussion. Patrick, I will come back to this floor later.
Joe Gagnon, a senior fellow here at Peterson Institute. My question is for any of the panelists. We talked a lot about uncertainty and scenario analysis. And so when I hear that, I think of the exogenous shocks to your model. Could they be commodity supply, policy, technology, whatever that we have to think are possible and how to deal with that. But my question is, what about what Philip mentioned, which was also nonlinearities in the model that you might not have recognized? I've worked on nonlinearities in inflation before COVID, and since then, there's been an explosion of work in that area, but there could be other nonlinearities. Do you have, is part of the scenario analysis a systematic search for how your models could be wrong and how you feel about that or think about what that would mean for scenarios? Is that part of the framework that you envision?
Who wants to?
Well, maybe I'll say one thing, and there's an ECB working paper or some kind of publication about it, which is interesting, which is, of course, it doesn't take very long to run the model. You press a button and the model is run. So most of the forecast or the meeting preparation is, in what ways is the model wrong on this occasion? Because otherwise, you don't need a meeting, I think. And what's interesting is when you zero in on forecasting, this is essentially the role of staff judgment. So on this occasion, what is the nonlinearity we should be focusing on, if you like? So, I think probably across all central banks, one of the big issues throughout this whole period is, because we know there's intrinsic persistence in inflation. For many reasons, if inflation is 4 this year, there's reasons like wage catch up, supply chains, why inflation might be 4 next year. But and there's kind of historical estimates of how quickly that fades out. But of course, that's okay. When is history going to be a good guide? Should we nudge up that kind of persistence factor and nudge it down? And that's where data dependence and trying to really learn. So of course, for us, when we obviously do internally many different sensitivity analyses scenarios. But over the last 5 years, we have published selectively scenarios. The pandemic, we published scenarios. The Russia-Ukraine war, we published scenarios. We published scenarios actually with the Middle East situation in autumn 23. But of course, behind that, many times we look internally. So let me differentiate between sensitivity analyses and scenarios. And for me, I would reserve scenarios. Like you've got a whole narrative there. You narrate out, here's a particular way the world could turn. Whereas if you say, okay, what happens if the oil price is in the 90th percentile, not in the middle? What happens if the wage dynamic to prices varies? So, there's a whole grid. You can do a whole grid, and because you do it every time, people understand the nature of the sensitivity analyses. But the art or science of selecting, okay, what do we really think is the concrete upside or downside risk on this occasion? I think is there. So maybe, Joe, I would say in our sensitivity analysis, that kind of model risk is, I think, routine. But when I think about scenario analysis, it's more about, as you say, the kind of shocks hitting the world and so on.
Yeah, if I can just add, I mean, I think it's a really great question, Joe. I would say, I mean, we're thinking about scenarios as being more than just this sort of idea that you shock a parameter and you change it. Where it becomes helpful for policymaking, and I think it's really important that you choose, and as policymakers, we think about scenarios and we choose the scenarios that are most useful for us in thinking about monetary policy settings and what should they be. But actually, it's this point about you have a view of the economy and how it might be turning out, but there could be alternative things going on. What if people's response to inflation and their formation of inflation expectations in the future is different from it was in the past because of the high rates we've seen, for example? What would that mean? And the value of doing scenarios in that way is, and using sort of bringing the macro modeling tools to that, is it allows you to think through all of the consequences of that story and how it would fit together and how different people would respond. So I think you can do it in this sort of exogenous shock way. It's more useful, I think, if you think, well, hang on, what if our understanding of the Phillips curve is just different? What if it's just different at this point? What would that mean? How would that change the behavior of lots of people in the economy and bringing it together? So I think that's the real value of it, is it allows you to follow that sort of thought through and then think. And then I think this is a really interesting area of work. Okay, what does that mean for monetary policy? Both what should the sort of policy be, but also what is the consequences if you set monetary policy in one world when you might be in another, and thinking through those kind of sort of the sort of loss function or welfare function.
Right. So I do agree with this distinction between sensitivity analysis and scenario analysis that Philip made, which I think is an excellent point, but it's a very good question. I think we can work with uncertainty in different ways. We can think about satellite models that can inform whatever DSG model we have at the core of our, projections, and say, we think this parameter is likely to be higher in the current environment, and we should think about that sort of scenario. I think scenarios are useful for thinking about tail risks, but if you are in one of these sort of tail risks events where where you risk a de-anchoring of expectations and so forth, it's very hard to say exactly how you would react. So it's very data dependent. So I guess the lesson that we learned is that we really need to think through these scenarios carefully, and because what markets do is that they go back and say, you talked about this scenario, aren't you actually in that situation now? What's to say that this is different from the scenario? So we need to be careful in exactly how we formulate that and think about how would we truly act in that situation.
Thank you. Patrick?
Yeah, my question is about these periodic policy reviews. So I noticed that for the large central banks, ECB, Federal Reserve, it's largely an internal process. Obviously, they're looking at what other people are saying outside. The smaller central banks, Sweden, you mentioned New Zealand, Canada, it's very heavy reliance on external reviewers. And in the middle, and I'm wondering, maybe the large central banks might be missing a trick, because in the middle, we have a Bank of England, which sometimes reaches out to somebody like Ben Bernanke. Are there inherent advantages in looking externally, or special advantages in keeping it in-house?
Yeah, if I could just comment on that, I think it's a very good question. I think we've gone with external reviewers because we want that outside, bigger perspective, bigger picture. But I think it's also crucial that it's someone that has knowledge of the institutional features of that country. So I think that's the point you're making as well. So I think there's a trade-off there. Yeah.
I mean, I would, the only thing I would say, I would really agree with that. I think there's huge value to looking externally. I mean, I would say that, right? I used to be the chief economist at the OECD, but you can I mean, at the end of the day, we're all roughly trying to do the same thing, and we have very sort of shared challenges. And so you can learn a huge amount, frankly, from looking at other countries and what they've done. And, it's often the same debate and discussion, and it's very interesting to understand, well, why did you pick that particular approach? What is it? You do, however, have to recognize, there are different institutional setups which make a real difference, different actually some of the sort of constitutional political stuff that just becomes very different in the sort of structures that you're operating with, the size of your financial market, those sorts of things all make a difference. But I think the value, it's hard to argue against getting outside views on what you're doing. I mean, also just actually, if I take the review that Dr. Bernanke did for us, I mean, it was brilliant that he had so much experience of how it could be different, but equally, and a good connection to also the sort of academic side of this as well, which is bringing in new ideas. That's the other thing I would say is you don't want to always just be using just former policymakers. You actually also want a mix, really, of people that will also be at the forefront, at the frontier of the latest economic thinking too.
I think it's an interesting question. And, when I was governor in Ireland, and indeed when I was an academic, I participated in reviews of small central banks. So as you hinted, there is a scale issue here. I think Jay Powell made a very useful remark the last week or two, which is basically there's no shortage of outside critics of the ECB. So he had some phrase about well-compensated, watcher community, and of course, there's people here today. So what's interesting is the area at one level is well set up for that in terms of, I don't need to commission the people in this room. They're going to write anyway. I think there is an issue where for academia, I mean, there's some really good Euro area macro people, and they write via the CPR, VoxEU, ECB watchers. But what is maybe true is the Euro area is this compendium of 20 member countries. By and large, most macro people in academia, they probably understand their own economy more than they understand the Euro area. And so maybe here, it's an important institutional feature of the Euro area or the ECB. It's a staff forecast. And with the review we're doing right now, it's so helpful for the Governing Council that we have a staff which I consider very independent, full of professional pride and professional standards. And a lot of that work has been published and will be published in the future. And so for me, the biggest foundation for when the Governing Council discusses this is we trust the Eurosystem staff. It's not Frankfurt, it's all the national central banks are involved. And having that kind of robustness that, oh yeah, well, if all of these if the staff across the Eurosystem are kind of converging on some point, that gives a lot of confidence that this is a relevant point. So I would say in our particular situation, I think we're very happy to have the foundation of the staff prep work for the review. But we absolutely, through the watchers, through other ways, do try to listen to external voices.
Thank you. I think we have at least time for at least one question, please.
Liz Unsal from the OECD. Just a quick question. There's a bit of a sense that inflation dynamics might have changed after COVID. Now we know that the sectoral changes in inflation could have a permanent impact on inflation expectations. Supply shocks may be more important going forward. Of course, one implication of this is that, as you all mentioned, there's more emphasis on scenario analysis, but more concretely for monetary policy framework, what could this imply for the inflation target, the bands around the target, whether there should be some asymmetry on the upside? So I just wanted to get your views on that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You're coming from the OECD, you have to answer.
Great to see you, Phyllis. Look, it's a really good question. I mean, clearly, inflation dynamics may have changed. In 10, 20 years' time, we might know. And of course, we're spending a huge amount of time now trying to think about that and analyze that. I think there's lots of reasons that you think you should be testing that hypothesis. As I mentioned in my previous answer, you've had this long period of inflation being well above people's experience sort of historically. For the UK, you have to go back to the 1970s to see the sorts of numbers that we've seen in the sort of period a few years ago. There's also a set of questions about sort of pricing dynamics and the labour market and changes that we've seen in the labour market in response to COVID and wider trends and the interaction of these wider trends there. And of course, pricing dynamics are changing with technology as technology changes and all of those sorts of things. So all of these things are going on. there's a huge, it's not even clear what direction all of this is moving in, right? So, you can think, well, some of these might think causing more upside risk to inflation, some more downside risk to inflation, some might mean things move faster, some mean they move less quickly. In the absence of even being able to call the direction of this stuff, you're not going to change your inflation target on that. But actually, more importantly, what I would say is I think there is huge value on having a very clear, simple, symmetric inflation target that everyone knows, everyone understands, and the sort of cost of changing that itself is quite high, just because of the importance of the clarity of the mission, because inflation expectations are so core, as Anna said, to everything that we do, and our ability to manage inflation in a way that minimizes costs to the economy. So I think I would put a very, very high bar, and I actually don't see any convincing evidence that we'd want to be looking at changing this.
Anna?
Yes, so I agree that we should definitely maintain symmetric inflation targets. I think there are many benefits to that. Just very quickly on sort of what we learned through the inflation surge of 2022-23, I think we are developing new early indicators of price increases, looking at heat maps, that sort of thing, forward-looking indicators, looking at surveys. I think that's the lesson learned, that, we came from this environment of very weak inflation, and I think we did learn that lesson that, it could happen very quickly and we need to be vigilant. So I think that there are lots of lessons learned from that inflation surge in terms of how we work with the data.
So let me, especially with the last point about, because the mechanism is indeed, I think, price resetting becoming more frequent. And so we do have surveys of price and behavior. This is where the day-by-day data can also help. I think this has been a valuable addition about to have a precise thing to look at. But let me go back to, do we really think the pandemic was a classic supply shock? Because, it has this unique property that it also led to this preference shift towards goods and then back towards services. And so, here is different, but in Europe, overall level of consumption never really got very high during this period. So you could hardly say, well, aggregate demand boomed in this period, and therefore, but demand for goods in 2021, demand for services in 22 did grow strongly very quickly. So it was not a classic supply shock. There was this element also to it. And so the question for the future is, classifying shocks really is one element. The second element is, inflation has come back to target within a couple of years now. So the question was, how much will, because of course in the 1930s, so the people who say there's this generational footprint of high inflation or spectacular economic conditions, a lot is identified after the 1930s. Some is identified after the 1970s, which is a decade of high inflation. So since we did get back to, I hope, to target more or less fairly quickly, and in the context of a decade of low inflation before that, how elastic expectations are around the anchor, I think is something that I'm going to have an open mind about, in the future years.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we have to close the session here. Thank you very much again to Peterson for organizing it. Thank you also for your active participation, and thanks a lot, Anna, Claire, and Philip, for accepting and for very good discussion.